Hi, I'm Daniel and I want to show you how to take attention-grabbing watch photos with just a mobile phone. You'll learn several skills that are actually really easy to do but will have a big impact on the photos you produce. So you can go from this to this, or this, or even this. All those photos were taken here with a mobile phone with the light from that window, and I'll show you how. My background in photography starts when I was a little boy and I got a film camera for my birthday. I loved that camera, took many photos with it, and in the decades since then I have built up that experience. I've had photos published in magazines in the UK and here in Japan, where I now live. I'm a member of the UK's National Photographic Society and I have an art and design specialisation from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I want to share that knowledge with you if you're a beginner to photography, or even if you're not actually really interested in photography, you just want to take better photos to share on social media. Even if you're not a beginner, I still think there are things that could be of value to you in the course in terms of ideas, inspiration, because let's face it, when we have creative hobbies, we never really stop learning. Now, although I enjoy using so-called proper cameras for photography, I genuinely enjoy using phones as well. The simplicity means that there are fewer things to go wrong, and also you can divert all your attention to the image rather than to the settings and things like that. The image quality is also excellent, and all the photos that you can see now were taken on my mobile phone. For that reason, the requirements for the class are really minimal. You'll need a watch and a phone, and that's pretty much it. It also means that we don't need any extra fancy apps. We won't be doing any extra editing, so just the default camera app is fine, whether it's an iOS phone or whether it's Android. Although the focus of the class is watches, it's relevant to other small items like jewellery, which face the same problems of reflections on shiny surfaces. I think some of the skills like composition and lighting will also be relevant for more general product photography, whether that's a beautiful ornament that you have or even some delicious cupcakes that you've baked and want to take a photo of. In any case, by the end of the class, you'll be able to produce a photo, or hopefully many photos, of your watch that you'll be proud to show to others and maybe even make them a bit jealous. So let's get started. Your project for this class is to create a photo of your watch using a mobile phone, obviously. I tend to use a square format when I do mobile photography so I can share it on social media easily, but if you prefer vertical or horizontal, that's also fine. It's a pretty easy project. However, you can add complexity if you want to, depending on how much time and energy and creativity you have. What I would like to see though is you try to use the different skills that we're learning in each of the lessons. So that's composition, background, reflections and how to control them, exposure, props, and lighting. Now, if all that sounds overwhelming, please don't worry. Each lesson is pretty short and we're going to take it step by step, nice and easy. One thing I'd recommend is to take as many photos as possible, more than is necessary, which kind of sounds obvious, but we may have a tendency to try and line everything up perfectly and then go for that one ultimate shot. It's possible, but I think it's much safer if you just take as many as you can during your whole process, during the whole photo session. So for example, you would take some safety shots at the beginning as you're setting up. Then when you think you've got everything how you like it, you go for what's hopefully going to be your best shot. Then you adjust a few things, maybe move things around, change the composition, move things based on where the light is coming from, take a few more shots. They might be better, they might not. And then when you've done all that and you think you've got your shot, you're happy with what you've got, now's the time to make even more changes, but also experiment and go a bit wild. For example, I was taking photos of a diving watch recently. The background was some pebbles to sort of evoke the sea, and the lighting was good. I tried a few different compositions. I got one I was really happy with. Great, just about at the end, and I tried to force myself to do something extra. So what could I do? and I decided to get the spray out and just spray it with water. It's a waterproof watch. So I sprayed it with water. I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, but I was delighted. This is it. This is the shot, and it's one of my favorites. This should be a fun challenge, producing something at the end that you can share with others. You may find that even through the class, mid-lesson, you're suddenly getting inspired. That's fine. Stop the video, take a few photos, go back to the lesson, and then take a few more photos. However you approach it, when you're happy with your project image, go to the Create Project button on the project page and upload it. You can change it later if you like, and also look at other people's projects as well, because that can get you even more inspired. So let's get ready. What's the first step? It's to prepare a few basic items. Obviously, you will need a mobile phone with a camera to take photos, and you will need a watch or something to be the subject of your image. Then a table with a nearby window, ideally away from direct sunlight. So I'm in the northern hemisphere. This is a north-facing window. We're going to be using just natural light during this class. A soft cloth for wiping fingerprints and things off the watch, but also for wiping the camera lens on the phone, which is something we often forget. And finally, this piece of very expensive camera equipment. It's just parchment paper, baking paper from the kitchen, and we're going to use this to reduce shadows and control reflections, effectively using it as a kind of light tent. So, probably the cheapest bit of photo equipment you'll ever buy. That's the essential stuff, but I do recommend getting some different textiles or objects or things to use as a background and also as props. That basically is up to you depending on what you have available and also depending on the emotion or the message that you want to convey in your image. Anyway, that's all we need. We're ready to get started. See you in the next lesson. Now, before we start shooting, I've got 5 recommendations for very quickly setting up your phone so that it can be the same as mine and you can follow along in the class pretty much exactly as I'm doing it. The first recommendation is to not use portrait mode, just use regular photo mode. Portrait mode will add a fake blur to things in the background, but because we're going to be taking pretty close-up pictures, when you take a photo of something and it's close to the camera, things in the background will automatically go out of focus, just naturally they'll be blurred. So that's the effect we need. We get it for free when we're doing close-up photography. So you don't need to use portrait mode. Next, if your phone has multiple lenses, I recommend not using the widest one, or sometimes called super wide or 0.5x. Again, we're going to be taking pretty close-up photos, and when you do that with a super wide lens, straight lines are likely to become quite bulged and curved, kind of like a goldfish bowl effect. And we don't want that with our beautiful watches. So stick to the regular 1x lens. If you have a telephoto lens, a 2x lens, then yeah, give that a try as well, but best to avoid super wide. My third recommendation is to switch off the flash. Flash will give you a lot of light, make everything look really flat, and we want nice shadows and texture and shape. We want to be able to see all that. So switch off the flash, and that's pretty easy. In all iOS and Android cameras that I've seen, you go to the camera app and there's a little lightning bolt symbol there. If you press that, you can toggle between on, off, maybe auto. I recommend just switching it off. My next recommendation is to switch off a thing called HDR, which stands for High Dynamic Range. Basically what this does is it makes things that are too bright in the picture not quite so bright, and things that are too dark not quite so dark, which is really helpful if you're taking a picture of people in bright sunlight and their faces are all in the shade. But we want shadow, we want bright parts, and we want full control. So I recommend switching that off, and in many versions of iOS and Android, from the camera itself, you'll see a little HDR icon, and you can just press that to toggle between on and off or auto. In other versions of iOS, you might have to go to the phone settings, and then to camera, and then to smart HDR or auto HDR. For Android, it varies based on the version, but generally you go into the camera app, you can click on the settings icon, and then there might be an auto HDR option there. If not, look for shooting mode or advanced, and within either of those there should be an HDR option. My final recommendation is to switch on the grid. Now this is an overlay that's visible in the camera app, but it doesn't show up in your photos. And it's like a sort of tic-tac-toe grid of 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines. I'm going to explain how to use this in the next lesson about composition, but to switch it on iOS you go into Phone Settings, Camera, and then Grid. On Android, again, it depends on the version, but generally in the camera app, if you click on the settings icon, and then it might be in a composition section, but you should be able to find grid type, grid lines, assistive grid, something phrased like that. And you can either switch it on or off, or in some versions, you'll get the choice of grid. And I recommend using the 3x3 grid. So those are my 5 easy recommendations for setting up the camera as I'm going to be using it in the class. If you have live photo or top shot mode, feel free to use that. It's not going to have any effect on the final image, so that's as you prefer. And I'm going to leave you with one bonus tip. When we're taking photos, sometimes we're going to get quite low. And if you're finding that you want to take a really low shot and the table's getting in the way, just turn your phone upside down. And the shutter button will then be at the top probably, but that's okay. The phone usually will work out the correct orientation afterwards, if not just rotate it. But that's a really handy way of getting very, very low shots. So I think we're ready for the first lesson on composition. See you there. Okay, let's kick off lesson 1, and it's about composition, which is effectively the position or the layout of different things within an image. Now, to help with composition, I'm going to share 5 simple rules with you, and you can try and follow all of them in one image. That's probably a bit too much, but you can pick 2 or 3 to help you with the composition, to help you with the layout. However, like all rules, they're there to be broken. So it's fine to understand the rules, but then break them if you wish. But do break them on purpose. So, kicking off with the first rule of straight lines being level. It doesn't just apply to the sea and the horizon in sunset pictures, obviously, but it also applies to our watch photography. So let's get started. Okay, we're going to start off with a base level photo, which I'm not going to think about. Let's bring it down to view a bit. I've got my flash switched off on my phone, and I'm going to take a photo. And it's pretty bad. So the first rule, which we can use to try and improve this, and it's to make straight lines level. So as we can see, we've got lines on the table here with the wood. So first of all, I'm going to make sure it's lined up with that. And then within the frame, I'm going to make sure that the watch and the wood are also lined up. I think that's level. It's still not very exciting, but that's following the first rule. The next rule is another simple one, and it's to allow breathing space around items or parts of items within the image. So for example, if you have your watch, just give a little bit of a space around it rather than making it touch up right to the edge of the image, because again, that can feel a little bit jarring and unsettling. Now, it's a rule, it's there to be broken, so if you don't want to allow breathing space, then break the rule on purpose and actually have the item or the part of the item partially off the screen. A lot of this can be done at the cropping stage, so in general it's better to move out a little bit, take a bit more of the photo than you need, and then later on you can crop it down. Now obviously I can think about the face of the watch and allow breathing space around there, but there's also different parts of the watch which stand out, like these metal bits here and even the buckle at the top. And so when I'm taking the photo, if I'm not careful, I can really think about the face and sort of ignore what's happening with the buckle. And so I could take this photo, and the buckle is kind of half there, half on the edge, half chopped off. It's a bit unclear what I'm trying to do with that. So let's try it again, and this time we'll actually give some breathing space to the buckle. Okay, and I think that's a little bit better. The third rule is coincidentally called the rule of thirds. And this is maybe something you've heard of because any photography book or course will cover this. And what it means is you split the image into 3 parts vertically and 3 parts horizontally. and the main subject, the main thing you're taking a photograph of, should be positioned roughly on one of those lines that's either 1/3 in or 2/3 in. Imagine you've got a tic-tac-toe board. Where those lines are drawn and also where they cross, that's where the item you're photographing should be positioned to make it feel really natural, to make it feel like an engaging picture. There's a tic-tac-toe sort of image overlaid on here, and so I'm going to line up the watch on the left hand side. Let's leave some breathing space for the buckle as well. The lines are all straight, and take a photo like that. Now obviously I could do the same thing on the right hand side. Now I think I prefer the second one because with the first picture where the watch is on the left hand side, this shadow here gets cut off. It's very easy to forget about the shadows, but the shadows in photography are so important, and this one gets cut off a bit when the watch is on the left hand side. When it's on the right hand side, the shadow is fully visible, and to me that feels a bit more comfortable. Now we've just thought about the rule of thirds vertically, let's think about it horizontally. And so as well as having the watch positioned to 1/3 or 2/3 in from the image, I'm going to put the face at 2/3 from the top. So it actually is positioned where the grid lines cross at the bottom right. Let's take that. Okay. I'm going to try changing it a bit so that the face is now at the intersection of the top two lines, top right. And as you can see, that actually made me move the camera away to fit it all in. It's made the watch quite a bit smaller, but it still kind of feels balanced. Although it's off to one side, everything is visible, and to me that feels kind of interesting compared to just the central straight-on photo that we started with. On to rule number 4, and it's to use diagonal lines or leading lines. Now we may not realize it, but we actually really like diagonal lines in pictures. I don't know why, but they can really transform an image. And again, it's breaking the first rule of keeping your straight lines level, but it's doing it on purpose. And it's in two parts. So first of all, using diagonal lines in an image can really enhance the image. But also leading lines are when we take part of that diagonal line and we make sure that it's roughly in the corner of the image. And what that does is it brings our eye from the corner of the image into whatever it is you want the viewer to look at, into the main subject. So far we've had everything straight. Now let's get diagonal. And again, we're going to break the rule on purpose, the rule of having the straight lines level, and we're really going to go diagonal. And so I'm going to stick with my overhead photograph, have it at 45 degrees, why not, and take a photo like that. And I kind of like that, but we've been doing it overhead all this time. Why not move around a bit and have the camera itself on a diagonal? So when we say diagonal, we don't mean just the object in the photo, but put the camera at a diagonal and then see how that goes. Doing it this way, it means the strap is thicker towards the bottom, and so it creates a feeling of perspective, bringing us into the picture more. Now we can obviously change things around, make things a bit more diagonal. Let's try not 45 degrees, but having it at, what's that, roughly 30 degrees, I suppose. Now I think this is interesting because you can see the crown more clearly. However, the strap is not coming into the corner of the image, and so it's not really bringing the viewer's eye in as much as the previous image. So I think I prefer it coming in from the corner, but we're getting to the stage now where it's up to you to choose which you prefer. You're the artist. You can create the image however you like. And finally on to rule number 5, which is not talked about as much, but it's the use of spirals in an image. I don't mean literal spirals, but having objects or things that create the feeling of a spiral. And this can really draw somebody in to the image. Now onto spirals, And although I can't create a perfect spiral shape with this watch, I can twist the strap around to create a spiral-ish kind of shape. It won't go into a really nice curl, but if I just tuck that under and try and make sure it's level, thinking about our first rule, then that kind of creates a spiral, bringing the viewer to the face of the watch. So let's give that a try using the angle of the camera that we were just doing, like sort of, from the side, a bit lower down. And again, I want to tap on the screen just to make sure the face is in focus. Take that. And that's quite good. That's quite interesting. What about if we go back to the overhead style that we were doing earlier? Let's try that. Tap to focus. Make sure the lines of the table, the wood on the table, are straight and level. Okay. One thing we talked about earlier was giving things room to breathe and also pay attention to the shadows. So we've got quite an interesting shadow here with a bit of light peeping through. In the image I just took, it's kind of the shadow is just coming up to the edge of the image. I'm ideally should be chopping it off deliberately or giving it breathing space. So I'm going to try and do that again, and let's try chopping it off first. And what this also does is it means that the watch face is now on the rule of thirds line. It's on the grid line. So that's good. Take that photo. Okay. However, I'm not really happy with this being chopped off that much. So let's try the opposite thing and give it some breathing space. And what this does, conveniently, it moves the watch face to the right hand sort of rule of thirds line on the grid. Take that photo. And now I'm really pleased we've got all this breathing space for the shadow. You can see the interesting light sort of shape there, as well as the spiral bringing us into the face of the watch, which is on the right hand third of the image. And that's, for me, that's the best one so far. You might prefer one of the other ones we've taken, but that's fine. It's creative, it's artistic, so we're all going to have different opinions. But anyway, I think we can agree we've definitely improved on the very first image that we took just by playing about with composition and the different rules of composition. Now, I've demonstrated these rules using a watch on a strap, which is super easy for either generating a straight line or a curved line. However, you might have a watch on a bracelet, which is a bit more tricky. You can't adjust it and move it into different shapes, but you can keep it on your wrist. And now you've got a straight line that you could either position within the tic-tac-toe grid, the rule of thirds, or using as a diagonal line to lead in. So to recap those rules of composition, we've got making sure your straight lines are level, giving things a bit of breathing space, using the rule of thirds, using diagonal lines and leading lines, and then trying to create the feeling of a spiral. So you can use one or more of those in your images, but they should make a big difference. We're still quite far away from having something that's really going to grab people, but we'll make more progress in the next lesson where we cover backgrounds. So, see you in the next video. So far, we've been taking photos of our watch just straight on the table, so the background has been the tabletop, but the image has been quite boring because of that. What I think we should do now is try different backgrounds to make the image more interesting. I'm going to keep using the black diving watch I've got here, and instead of this wooden table, let's first of all go with a white background, pretty much as simple as you can get. And I'm going to stick with this sort of spiralish shape that we used in the composition lesson, because that was my favorite. Something like that. Oh, there's always a bit of dust that finds its way onto the glass. Right, I've got my phone ready. I've wiped the lens on this. I've got the flash switched off, and same kind of composition. Let's just go for that. Okay, and I've got to say, it's not really doing anything for me. So I want to get rid of the white and try black instead. I'm going with white and black because the watch is pretty much mostly just monotone. And already I'm thinking that could be better. Let's try again. Let's just take this. Okay, not bad. I'm quite happy that we can still see the shadow even though it's a black background, so I like that. But what about if we tried a different color? And I've got an orange here, nice bold color. So again, the same kind of composition. Oh, there's a slight crease on the paper there, so I'm going to move it across. Okay, and let's line it up. Aha, this is not bad. The shadows and even the slight reflection from the buckle is quite visible there on this background, which I do like. I like that. An obvious alternative to just plain paper is plain material. And obviously there are many different types of texture and color that you can use depending on the type of watch, whether you want to complement it, whether you want to contrast with it. But of course, you don't have to stick to pieces of cloth like this or a tablecloth. You can even use your own clothing, a bright colored jacket or some interesting fabric with a pattern on, depending on the message or the emotion that you're trying to create in the image. Right, I've got some material here laid out flat, which flat like this is not much more interesting than the plain paper. So I'm going to scrunch it up, and that should do a couple of things. One, it makes it more interesting because we now get different areas of light and shade, but also we should have some creases like this, which maybe we can use as leading lines into the corners of the image. So let's try this first of all, just as it is with an overhead shot, as we've been doing. And I'm going to position the face on the bottom third of our grid, leaving a bit of breathing space for the buckle at the top. Press the focus. And I'm not super in love with that, so let's try alternate composition. And I'm going to put the watch face at the top, on the top line of the rule of thirds grid. And it's still not great. Also, one thing with this watch, it's got a domed glass crystal, which is very reflective. It picks up everything. And I can even see the reflection of the camera in the image. I don't want that. I'm going to talk about reflections in another lesson, but for now, the easy thing to do is to simply move the camera to one side. And this now actually reflects the window just over there, but I think that's a bit more acceptable. So let's give this a try. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to try and use this crease at the side as a leading line up from the corner. So I've got that leading line from the corner. I've got the watch face positioned at the intersection of the top and the right-hand side grid lines. Let's give that a try. And that's not too bad. I could create another leading line by positioning the strap at an angle. So that's going to the bottom corner, and this crease is coming into the left-hand corner. Let's try that again. And as with some of the other shots, it's really a case of which you prefer. I think they're both acceptable, so the choice is yours. In addition to thinking about the texture and the color of the background and whether it complements or contrasts with the watch, it's also important to think about the vibe or the atmosphere of the watch itself. Watches are made for many different purposes, many different target audiences, and as an example, I've got one here. It's actually a world time watch, so kind of for traveling, but I put it on a khaki kind of green strap. And so for me, this now has feelings of either the military or of something related to nature, so hiking, bird watching, something like that. That's the vibe I'm getting. It might be different for you, but anyway, to go with that, I handily borrowed from my son his laptop case, which just happens to be this sort of camouflage pattern here. So maybe this is kind of creating or enhancing the atmosphere of the watch, and that could work. Let's give it a try. Let's stick with, I think, this head-on shot and see if I can just keep all the camouflage in there. And I've got the watch lined up on the left-hand side of the rule of thirds grid. Okay, that's not bad, but it's also not super exciting. And I think, although the camouflage matches the vibe here. It's still a flat surface and I'm not getting anything from it. It's not exciting me. So I've got an idea. I'm going to try something else, continuing this kind of nature outdoors theme. I've got some moss here from the garden, which I think might work a bit better. I'm keeping the laptop case because if there are any gaps in the moss, at least something greenish is going to show through rather than the tabletop. So let's give that a try. There goes the watch. And because the space with the moss on is actually even smaller than the laptop case, I'm going to have to get pretty close. Let's try another overhead shot. I'll keep it on the left-hand side as before, but I won't be able to include the whole buckle in, so I'll have to zoom in a bit tighter. Which is okay, I like the background, but because I had to get so close, my hands and the camera are very visible now as reflections. So to get around that, let's put the camera at an angle and try again. I can try to get the buckle in, but I might include some of the background. No, I think that's going to work. Let's give it a try. So I'm giving the buckle a bit of space there. I'm having it at a diagonal. I've got the leading line and I'm putting the watch face directly in the center. And that's not bad, but I'm going to try getting in even closer and being careful about the edges. I'm deliberately cutting off the buckle, but these other black loops, I want to not have them sort of half in, half out. They're included and they've got a little bit of breathing space. Let's try again. The watch face is now sort of upper right a bit more. It's at the intersection of the top and the right-hand side lines on the rule of thirds grid, and I think I prefer that. So that was a variety of backgrounds and ways that you can use them to improve your watch photography. But one thing you'll notice I haven't included is very, very shiny surfaces. Now sometimes you see these in magazines, beautiful shiny surface and the watch reflecting on it. It's possible, but it's actually quite difficult because reflections can cause all sorts of problems. And that just happens to be what the next video is about. So stay tuned, I'll see you there. We've seen how reflections can cause a bit of a problem, so let's try and tackle that now with some easy solutions. The first one, if you're taking an overhead shot, is simply to move the camera further away. That's what I've done in this shot. I was getting reflections, so I moved the camera higher and I also positioned the watch to one side, and that also reduced direct reflections of the camera. So that works fairly well. Another easy thing, as we've done before, is simply move the camera to an angle at the side, and then you don't get reflections of the camera, obviously, but you do get reflections of things surrounding you, and that could be okay or it could be distracting. So sometimes it works, sometimes we need to go a step further. The next step is to try and cover or hide any objects that are reflecting. So firstly, I've got a red phone, which is really not a good idea for close-up photography, so ideally I should cover this in a more neutral color. Similarly, depending on your skin color, you might want to wear white or black gloves so that your skin, your hands are less distracting. If there are still objects around you that are reflecting and you can't do much about it, then there's a thing called a light tent, which is often used in product photography. It has a flap here. You put your watch or whatever inside there, and you can either photograph it like this, but mostly you close up the flap, and then you've got a slot in the front to photograph the object with really, really minimal reflections. It's very useful, available pretty cheaply, but if you don't have one, there's something even cheaper, and it's the baking paper I mentioned before. So this works very well as a basic light tent, reducing reflections and also softening shadows, which is sometimes a very nice effect. On its own like this, it's kind of floppy and difficult to handle. So usually I'll just fold it in half, which makes it a bit stronger. And then it kind of acts as a tent with one hand, and then the other hand you're free to take the photos as usual. This is the setup that we've had before. And I mentioned at the time that the glass crystal on this watch is slightly domed, it's curved, which really reflects a lot. And we had trouble with the window being reflected last time. And so let's just recreate that. And now for the secret weapon, the baking paper. So I try and create a kind of tent here. And that seems to be doing a good job of shutting out the light. I'm trying not to get the paper in the corner of the image, but if it does, I'll just crop it out later. It's not a big problem. So let's try again. I think that's much better. And one thing it's done, it's also reduced the shadows as well. So we've still got shadows in it, but they're not as harsh as they are there without the baking paper. For this one, I'm putting the watch on a diagonal instead of a spiral. So I've got the strap making a leading line from the corner there into the face, which I've put in the middle. I'm breaking the rule of thirds and not having it 1/3 or 2/3 in. I'm deliberately putting it right in the center. So that looks okay to me. Let's take that. But if I look closely, I can see there's reflection of both the lampshade just above and also the window just over to my right. So let's bring on the baking paper tent to try and get rid of those reflections. And it can be tricky to not get the baking paper itself in the picture, but something like that seems okay. And I think you'll find that is a big improvement, not just with the reflections in the crystal, but also these shadows by the side of the watch. Now you may like them, I think this is an artistic thing. You may like them, but what the baking paper does is it reduces those a lot. Try that again. And makes the watch much sort of smoother, it gives it a much smoother feel. Not just the shadows, but also the tone of the metal around the watch. Another example that we've used before, this watch here on the moss, and I kind of like this composition where we sort of have it at an angle like that. But there's a bit of reflection coming in. Actually, the reflections are not too bad on this because it's not super shiny, but I'm still going to see what effect the baking paper can have. So let's bring the baking paper tint down and create that tint effect. Let's take this shot. Get the focus right. And now if we compare that to the first one without the baking paper, now we can see there's a difference. Okay, we've seen several ways to control reflections there, but you may have noticed in the ones where we used the baking paper light tint, some of them were a bit bright, and that's because the camera is automatically adjusting to the change in brightness and trying to compensate for it. We sometimes don't really want that, so in the next lesson I'm going to show you how to very easily adjust that, and in the process make your photos even cooler. So join me in the next lesson. You know those adverts where they say, with this one simple trick, you can change your home or change your life or whatever. Well, really, with this one simple trick, you can change your photos. It's simply adjusting the exposure. Now, exposure is another word for brightness, really. So it's making your photos a little bit brighter, or more commonly, making them a little bit darker to transform them, make them look really cool, like they've come out of a magazine. And fortunately, with mobile phones, it's dead easy. The reason why it is effective is because with watches in particular, you have a metal part which reflects things like windows, and they're called highlights. So we have bright highlights here and there, but we also have a lot of dark parts, for example, black dials. And ideally, we want the black parts to be properly black. And the highlights, we want them to still be there, but not too bright. If we reduce the brightness, reduce the exposure overall, then the black dial will be black, the highlights on the metal will be reduced, and also any background will be darker and therefore less distracting. So the whole result of that is the important part of the watch is emphasized more. It's a great effect, it's very easy, but you need to see examples to appreciate it. So let's get into it. I'll show you how to do it and the effect that it has. I haven't used watches on a bracelet very much, so let's do that now with this one. It also means a lot of reflections going on there. So we bring the camera in. As you can see, I've got my white glove to reduce the reflections of my hand. I'm also borrowing my wife's sort of silver colored phone. So I'm really trying to reduce the distractions in the metal. I'm positioning the watch to the right hand side, and I'm using this black background which is slightly textured, which I think is a nice effect. So I'm just going to take this photo first of all. I'm going to tap once to focus around the sort of the logo on the watch. Okay. And it's okay, but for me it's a little bit light. The reason I think that is because there's a phrase in photography called expose for the highlights. And so if I look at where the highlights are, especially around here on the watch, around the edge of the watch itself and the right hand side of the bracelet, they're washed out. I mean, they're almost white. And they shouldn't be like that. It's metal. I want them to look just a tiny bit grey. So what I'm going to do is make the whole image darker, reduce the exposure of the whole image, and that should make these highlights less washed out. Other parts will be darker, which is fine. It's the highlights that I want to think about and the watch face itself. This is an iPhone, and so to do that on an iPhone, you long press until you get this little sort of flashing effect, and then this comes up, AE/AF lock. AE is auto exposure, AF is autofocus. So it's locked the focus, it's locked the exposure, the brightness. And now moving my finger up and down the screen, I can make the whole image brighter or darker. On Android, it's very similar. Some Android phones will be the same. Others, you only have to tap once, and then a little slider will appear at the side with a picture of a sun or a picture of a light bulb, and you move that slider to make it brighter and darker. Anyway, some Androids are like this iPhone, long press, and then I'm going to make this whole image darker, as I mentioned. So I'm looking at the highlights, I'm looking at the dial, and that's a bit darker. I'm going to take that, and I think I prefer that. Not only has it reduced the highlights, but also the background, especially at the top left corner there, is pretty much black, which is fine because it's just unimportant, and I like that effect. It brings the attention down towards the watch in the bottom right. Now, if we try with a different colored background, I've actually got a magazine here, a watch magazine, that I'm going to use as the background. And sort of try and put that straight, and again the watch will go at a sort of diagonal like that. This background is lighter, and so if we try just with the sort of camera default setting, let's press to focus that, take the photo. The whole image is sort of correct brightness, but the watch itself, which is what I'm interested in, looks pretty dark to me. The camera has automatically made the image dark because of the light background. So what I want to do is I want to change the exposure, but I'm going to try making it brighter. So long press again. And then I'm going to slide up, and now some of the highlights are going too bright, but the main part of the watch, the dial and that bezel around the dial, they were too dark, and now I've made it brighter. I think they're okay. So let's take that. And I prefer that. Some of the page at the background is sort of washed out a bit, but again, the important part for me is the watch face, and so for me, that makes the better picture. I think you recognize this, the watch on the green strap with the moss background. I'm going to use the same composition as before, which was kind of on a diagonal like this. As before, I'm going to bring in the baking paper tint, and that's reducing the shadows and the reflections nicely. I like that. Overall though, it's quite bright, it's a white dial, and so now I'm going to use the exposure trick just to reduce it, and I think it's going to really make a big improvement. So first of all, let's long press on the dial, and that will lock the exposure and the focus. And now I'm going to reduce the focus, just the exposure, just by sliding down. In my mind's eye, I'm ignoring everything except that white dial. That's the important thing for me. I want that to be the correct exposure. Everything else right now I don't care about. So I'm adjusting the exposure. Yeah, that's too dark. Let's go up a bit. And maybe about here is good. So let's take that. And now if we compare before and after, I think you'll see there's a big difference. Now it's up to you how dark or how light you want it to go, but even just changing the exposure a bit, I think really improves the image. So changing the exposure, how cool is that? And so easy. I love it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that skill and some of the other things that we've learned, and now we're going to move on and bring in some props to really make our images more interesting and more engaging. That's all going to happen in the next lesson, so I'll see you there. And now it's time to play with props. Now, adding props to an image can change the picture from just a photo of a watch into a photo with a story, a meaning, or that generates some kind of emotional response from the viewer. When it comes to choosing props, it may be obvious based on the watch, or it may not be so obvious, in which case you can think about color. Are there other props of the same color for consistency, or a very different color for contrast? You could think about the type of watch it is and the situation that it's used. For example, diving watches obviously could be related to some water activity. A world time watch could use props to do with travel. And if it's a fancy dress watch, well, that could be worn when you're going out on a special occasion. So you could have a glass of champagne or something in the picture. Whatever you choose, you don't necessarily have to have a lot in the image to make a big difference. And so you'll see in the following examples, I've tried various props, but generally I think simpler has worked better for me. However, it's personal choice, so get your props ready, go crazy, and let's see what we can make. For this first example, I want to use a diving watch. This is a Seiko diving watch from the 1960s, and it's sort of monotone. So the prop I'm thinking of is also going to be monotone, so that it doesn't sort of distract from the watch. Also something similar, 1960s, it's sort of to do with outdoor and sports. So I've got a little model car here, which is also from the 1960s. It's also monotone, and it's also got this sort of outdoor sporty kind of feel to it. So I'm going to use that as my prop. Keep it simple, just one prop this time. In terms of positioning, I want the watch this way. I like it sort of pointing slightly diagonally and towards the window so that the light comes onto the face. And the car, I'm going to have pointing towards the watch, so I try and get the viewer's eye to come around towards where I feel the most important part is. Right, so that's roughly the kind of composition I want. For the camera, this time I'm going to be using this old iPhone 5S from 2013 because I want to show that you don't need a fancy phone to take good photos. I mean, even the screen is getting cracked, but I think it'll still do a good job. So let's have a go. First of all, the composition kind of like that. How does that look? Yeah, I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to focus on the watch, and I'm going quite close here. And one thing that happens is when you get very close to your subject, things in the background tend to go a bit out of focus, and that's what I want. Well, I'm pleased with that composition, but as you can see, there's a terrible reflection on the glass. It's just pure white. So you know what we're going to do. We're going to bring in the baking paper light tint. And let's position that so that it hopefully blocks out that reflection. And yep, straight away, that's doing a really good job. Okay, let's take that. Okay, pretty good. It's getting better. One thing we saw before is how to make things a bit darker, because on the right hand side of the watch in particular, it's looking quite bright and washed out, and you can't really see the details on the watch face. So, kind of long press to lock the focus and lock the exposure, and now I can adjust it manually. It's actually done quite a good job by itself, but I want to bring it right down, and I'm ignoring the background, I'm ignoring the car. I'm just thinking about the face of the watch, and maybe a tiny bit brighter. Let's try that. Okay, I like that. You can see the watch, but it's got the car in the background a little bit out of focus to sort of support the whole kind of message and the feeling of the picture. Sticking with the car theme, I've got a Mini branded watch here, which makes it nice and easy when thinking about props, because anything to do with minis is probably going to work. So I've got the watch, I've got a Mini book, and I've got the keyring here with the same Mini logo on. So that should all work, I think. I could have the watch on the book vertically like that, but I think it's a bit too close over there, so I'm going to try at a diagonal. And adding the keyring, I'm thinking about the composition lesson, and spirals are good in terms of directing the viewer's eye to the important part. So let's see if we can use the keyring as a kind of spiral. There. Back to the trusty old iPhone 5S. And let's see how this goes. I want things to either have breathing space at the edge or definitely be chopped off. So I'm going to definitely chop off the keyring and the buckle. And that's okay, that's not bad. It's maybe a little bit cluttered for me, so I'm actually going to try it without the keyring after all and see how that works. So I could come here. And that's not bad, but the watch is a little bit small in the picture, and the word mini is a bit too large for me. It's just too in your face. And so what I want to do is I want to make the watch face bigger by getting in closer. And I'm going to try chopping off the word mini completely. And if I have this at an angle, the strap will come into the top right corner, creating a leading line towards the watch face. And then the red mini is just on the corner of the left and the bottom lines on the rule of thirds grid. Let's give that a try. And I like that. I think the black and the yellow and then the red provide a nice, interesting contrast. It's relatively simple composition, but we have the leading line coming in. We're following the rule of thirds, and I think that works overall. Obviously, it's a creative decision, so you may prefer having extra props in there to really get that message across. Sometimes less is more, sometimes more is more. This setup is similar to one I've used before that I was very happy with. So I'm recreating it here. As you can see, I've got a load of pebbles here on the table, and they're kind of acting as a prop themselves, really. And they also help to prop up the watch. And I've got extra props here, which is a snorkel. Because this is a diving watch, the pebbles are supposed to represent, the side next to the sea, and somebody's just about to go snorkeling or has just been snorkeling. So that's the message, the story I'm going for. And I positioned the snorkel and the mask like this so that I can have them sort of coming into the bottom, ideally to the bottom corners. Something like that. There's a line coming into the bottom corner there. And I want to have the watch right at the top left. So actually beyond the rule of thirds, and I'm doing that on purpose. So let's give this a try. And it looks like I'm getting some reflections there. So I just want to try with the baking sheet. And instead of using it as a tent, I'm just going to have it kind of as a curtain, really, just softening the reflections coming from the window. What that's done is it's made the watch face much brighter. So that means I'm going to turn down the exposure of the whole image like that. And I like the sort of atmosphere now. I definitely like that being darker, but I'm not super happy with this layout. So I'm going to try something a bit different. And this time I'm going to see if I can somehow go back to the spiral effect where the top of this snorkel kind of points to the watch. Maybe something like that. Let's have a look. So I'm going to put the watch in the corner. Oh yeah, that could do. I'm chopping off some of the mask, that's fine, as long as it's not sort of just at the edge. Either give it breathing space, chop it off. I've decided to chop it off. And the snorkel is coming up, and it's kind of a spiral, isn't it? So yes, I'm pretty pleased with that. I'm still getting those reflections, so bring back the paper as a kind of curtain, and therefore I'm going to reduce the exposure of everything so that the watch face looks good to me. And let's try that. I'm pleased with that. And one thing I've tried before that worked is the final flourish. Spray it with a bit of water, just so it looks like it really is by the sea. So let's give that a try. I want to keep my phone out of the way. This is a waterproof watch, so I think we'll be okay. Maybe that'll be enough. It's made some of the pebbles darker, which is good. And so let's go back to adjusting the exposure. Oh, I want to move away a bit actually. I was chopping too much of the mask there. So moving away, bring the exposure down. Yeah, I really like that. And so I could add flippers or other things like that, more props, but this is where you can take it in whichever direction you like. So those are a few examples of using props in images. And as you can see, I tend to favor more simple pictures. I don't have too many props in there, although I do think they add something to the scene. I hope I've also shown that you don't need a fancy phone to take a good picture of a watch. You need the skills that we've been learning, you need some imagination, and you need good lighting. That's the final ingredient, and it's something we haven't talked about yet, but arguably the most important. So I'm saving that till last. Join me in the next lesson, and we'll learn how you can control the lighting to take full control of your pictures. You may have noticed in the lessons so far that the light of me doing these introductions has changed pretty much every time, depending on the time of day, depending on the weather outside. And so that's something that we maybe subconsciously have to deal with. If the color or the tone of the light changes, then there are some camera apps which will allow you to change the white balance. But generally we've been using the default camera app and we haven't really worried about that too much. The thing that has a bigger impact is the light direction. And that's what we're going to do now. So here's a couple of examples that show just how dramatic the change can be just by moving the watch around relative to where the light is coming from. For this first example, I'm not actually going to take any photos. I'm just going to video the watch here and then move the whole scene around so we can see how the direction of the light affects how the watch looks. I'm starting off here with a position that I've used actually for all the examples in the lesson so far, and that is with the light coming from the side. So the window is over in that direction, which means the light is hitting the watch like that on the side. And that means that where we've got sort of bezeled areas, here we can see that's picking up the light nicely and just on the inside there. And in the other side, there are shadows here and some shade there. There is another window, a smaller window over there, so it's not completely dark around here. The mini dials in there are recessed, and so they're actually quite dark because they're pretty much in the shade as well. But as you can see, we've got lots of mid-tone areas, but we've also got bright parts, we've got dark parts, which means that the whole watch feels kind of 3D. It's standing out nicely. We can imagine what the shape is, and it looks pretty interesting. We can also see the text here, which is engraved in the side. So let's try something else. We're going to rotate the whole scene so that the light, the window, is now behind the camera. And you can see if I move out of the way, there you can see the window behind. Okay, it's directly in that direction, which means the light is hitting the watch straight on. So there aren't really any areas with shadow. There are some highlights, but that's because I've got another window just sort of behind over there. Instead, everything is kind of a sort of middle tone, a mid-tone red, which is really good for readability. As you can see, all the dials are visible, the display is really visible. the text that is engraved is not really visible. So we lose that sort of 3D effect. And from a creative point of view, that makes the whole watch look pretty flat. So in general, having light coming from directly behind the camera doesn't make a super interesting image. Let's try the opposite. Turn 180 degrees now. So here we are with the window in that direction. And so the light is hitting the watch from the back there, which means that it's reflecting off the top of the strap here. So we're getting some highlights there, which is kind of interesting. But the rest of the watch is all in shade. And so it's very hard to see any of the details. And it's all pretty flat and dark. What we could do if we were going to take a photo here is really increase the exposure, increase the brightness. And that would make the whole background area probably look really, really bright and white, which is okay. And the watch itself would be much more visible. So this is kind of interesting if you want a dramatic effect, because you've got quite an extreme here of light and dark. But it can be hard to get this to work successfully. So for that reason, as I said, every lesson so far, I've used the watch like this with the window to the side, so the light is hitting every watch from the side from 90 degrees. In this example, I am going to take photos, and the watch I'm using is this one. It's got a slightly domed crystal, you might be able to see there. The dial itself is also slightly domed, and it's a textured dial. So I'm hoping these details will really help us see the differences when we change the lighting direction. The lighting direction I'm starting off with is straight on. So the window is that way, just behind the camera, which means the light is hitting the watch sort of straight on, but kind of from the bottom. I'm just going to have a very, very simple composition so that we can focus on the lighting. And we can see, well, not much really. Those details I was telling you about, they're not really visible because the lighting is so flat. In particular, the textured dial is hardly noticeable at all, unfortunately. So again, this is not really a successful lighting direction in general. What I think will work better is having the light coming from the side. So let's move around 90 degrees and give that a try. So now we have side lighting. The window is over there on the right, which means the light is hitting the watch from this direction. And let's give that a shot. We're kind of familiar with this setup. Let's see how it differs. And we can see some details in the textured dial there, especially the smaller sort of sub-dial at the bottom, which I like. There is highlight on the right-hand side of the crystal, so we can kind of see its slightly domed shape there. In particular, the dial is now starting to look domed. Also, we're getting a shadow on the left. The watch itself is producing a shadow which lifts it off the background rather than being flat. So we're getting a kind of 3D effect, and the whole image is now much more interesting. We have top lighting here, meaning that the window is over in that direction, and so the light is hitting the watch from the top there. When we did this with the red G-Shock watch, the whole face was really dark, and that's because the watch was sort of tilted up and we were at a lower angle. But because the watch is lying flat here, we haven't really got that problem this time. Now let's give that a shot, see how it looks. Well, I was off to one side there, but anyway, we can see the dial now has really got nice texture to it. The highlight at the top of the crystal is showing that it's slightly domed. We've also got quite a distinct shadow underneath the hour hand on the left, which really lifts that away from the dial. And I've noticed that the hour markers at 10, 11 and 1 and 2 o'clock have got both highlights and shadows, showing that they're not flat, they're slightly V-shaped. And I really like that detail there. I'd say I was expecting to prefer light coming from the side, but in this case, I like this top lighting. It, to me, makes it feel sort of more dynamic. Now, as this is the last example and the last lesson, why don't we go a step further and let's finish this off properly. Let's make this into a proper photo that hopefully we'd be proud to share on social media. So I'm going to take the background and just make it a bit more interesting first of all. And try and scrunch this up so that it can look kind of natural-ish. Maybe that's quite good there, sort of tucked in the center. Now, one thing I want to do actually before I forget is change the hands so that they point to 10, well, 8 or 9 minutes past 10. If I can pull the crown out. There we go. And this makes the whole face look much more balanced. You've probably seen this in magazine photos many times, but it's kind of like the standard thing to do when you're photographing a watch. If the watch is ticking or still running, then it can cause a problem. You could pull the crown out to stop it. Ideally though, a stopped watch is much more useful. I also want to make sure I've not got any fingerprints and dust on there. And that means also on the camera lens as well. Okay, let's see how that looks. And yeah, I think that could work. I've noticed that we've got a big bright reflection at the top of the crystal. You know what that means. We're bringing in the baking paper. So let's get a little tent set up there. That is muting the highlights and the shadows in the watch a little bit, but they're still visible, so I think that's okay. And the whole thing's pretty dark. I want it dynamic, I want it kind of moody, so I'm going to reduce the exposure. And the dial is still staying really bright, even though everything else around it is going dark, so that's working nicely. I can't quite reach, I'm going to have to go down with my thumb. And how does that look? Well, I like that. I was trying to take a photo to be proud of on social media, and I'd actually be proud of that if I'd taken it with a digital camera and a studio setup. To think that we just did this with a mobile phone, well, I think that's pretty impressive. Hopefully that has demonstrated that changes in lighting can really affect the photo, making it boring, making it detailed, making it dramatic, depending on what you want to achieve, what the purpose of the photo is. An awareness of lighting and being able to control it, even partially, I think is key to great photography. Now we've gone through the lessons and we have one more video left where I'm going to wrap things up and just reflect on the skills, but I'm also going to give you a couple of examples of where I've used those skills for watch photography with a mobile phone in the outside world, not here at this table. So join me then, I'll see you in the next video. Well done. You made it through all the lessons and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. I also hope you found it educational as well. We've learned several different skills through the lessons. We looked at the rules of composition right at the beginning. Then we looked at various kinds of backgrounds you can use in your photos. After that, we dealt with reflections and how to control them. Then there was the magical feature of exposure. Then we played with props a little bit. And finally, we looked at lighting and how changing the lighting can have a dramatic effect on your images. I did promise I'd show you a couple of examples of where I've tried to use those skills in photos that I've taken outside, in the wild, so to speak. So here we go. In this first example, it's taken on the terrace of a cafe, and I really liked the dappled light at the back there, so that's what I wanted to include. The composition that I was thinking of, well, I positioned the watch kind of on the right-hand side of that rule of thirds grid. It's almost actually bottom right, isn't it? And balancing that, I've got props over towards the top left, which are the glasses from the cafe. And my wife very kindly posing for me there. And I had trouble getting everything straight. So what I did is I deliberately broke that keep things level rule and put everything at an angle. And because of that, my arm being at a diagonal has become a leading line, bringing the eye in from the corner up to the watch face. There is a reflection on the watch glass, but I kind of like that, so I deliberately left that as it is. Finally, I wanted to make sure I gave things breathing space. So the straw coming out of the glass at the left has got a bit of breathing space around it. Similarly for the corner of the table at the top right. And again, the metal strap loop at the bottom right has got a bit of breathing space around it as well. In terms of exposure, I didn't touch it. I was quite happy with it how it was. In this next example, in terms of composition, I didn't put the watch on the rule of thirds. I actually broke that rule and had it right over there in the corner. Instead, I tried to create a kind of spiral-ish shape using my wife's body, that's her again, to sort of bring the eye in, following the line of the foot, the legs, and then gradually round along the arm towards the watch face. I think it kind of works. Maybe it requires a bit of imagination. But anyway, that was my intention. But I did keep to the rule of keeping things level, as you can see with the horizon right in the back there. I deliberately kept that straight. If that's not possible sometimes, then what you can do is obviously just rotate the image afterwards when you look at it and edit it. The background is partially it's the beach, which is a nice neutral sandy color, and then the blanket. I tried to keep that neutral as well, so it hasn't got any distracting patterns or bold colors in there. And finally, with the exposure, the bright sun meant that the watch face, which was in the shadow, was a bit dark, so I just increased it slightly, but not very much. So as you can see, you don't need to use every single skill that we've learned in all your photos. You can think of them as ingredients in the kitchen, and then you mix and match, combine them with your ideas, your imagination, and produce attention-grabbing watch photos. I want to thank you very much for following along this course. It's been a lot of fun making it, and I hope it's been fun following along. Now, I just want you to get your watch, get your phone, get creative, and I'm really looking forward to the images that you produce.